Now by Douglas Murray, who has written about this issue in Australia in his latest book, The Strange Death of Europe, and from Melbourne by the activist and actor Nakia Louie, a young leader within the Australian Aboriginal community. Good evening to you both. Douglas Murray, isn't it time to change Australia Day?
Well, I think a lot of Australians will wonder why, and will see it as being an assault on something very foundational about their nation, and indeed it is. I mean, there's all sorts of arguments to be had about history. Nobody would or could deny the treatment and the mistreatment and maltreatment of the Aboriginal peoples. But the problem here is that, as so often, the question is whether you're dealing with critics or enemies. And a lot of Australians will have heard the organiser of the protests on their national holiday talking not just about the invasion of Australia, but saying, F Australia, I hope it burns to the ground. Now, that is not the language of a critic of a country. That is somebody who's talking as an enemy. And that sort of talk
isn't that somebody who's perhaps kind of, in the end, so frustrated by the kind of, as it were, the kind of denial?
But Australia hasn't got denial about this. Australia has had national sorry days. They've had national signings of books to say sorry, all sorts of things. Australia hasn't ignored its past.
Nakia, what do you say to that Australia has not ignored its past?
Well, I think that Douglas Murray is operating on a few false premises there. The Australian Institute recently did a study which said that the majority of Australians don't care what day Australia Day is on. So if a day that's meant to celebrate and unify the country is on a date that is dividing us, I think then we need to examine the values that we're celebrating. And you speak of that there is no denial of the history of the past of Australia. Well, there actually is, and that's one of the things why we're protesting, is that we're having our national celebrations on a day, January 26, which represents the day Captain Cook put that Union Jack in the ground in Australia and declared it sovereign, which began colonisation, which resulted in genocide, over 500 massacres just on the east coast of Australia alone, up to 90% of the Aboriginal population wiped out, and that continued well into 1967, where my parents weren't considered Australian citizens. So there is a denial when you have your national day on a day that represents such brutality.
Isn't there a situation where you can say we live in a new modern Australia made up of all sorts of peoples, and so therefore we should create something new?
Well, Australia, again, has been having this discussion for decades now. This is not a new discussion.
But then there's a new generation coming up.
Sure, but what is striking about it, as I say, first of all, is the tone of the attack on Australia Day, the tone of burn this country to the ground, which is, I think we could all agree, across any...
That is incorrect. That is incorrect. That is incorrect. It's not about an attack on Australia Day. It's about changing the date.
But you don't deny that she said that. She did say that.
But this is one person. I want to actually come back to you.
One person. What about Douglas? By you highlighting that, which is it's a political playing card.
But she's the organiser of the so-called Invasion Day. I mean, that is important. She wasn't
the organiser of the so-called Invasion Day, and she has said that her comments were taken out of context.
No, she has refused to apologise. She said that she said that.
Please let me finish my sentence. It's no longer a British country. I'm a person who lives in this community.
I want to ask you about this historical hurt. I mean, how deep does it go, for example, for your generation?
Well, it continues on to this day, and that's the issue, is that the oppression of colonisation has made Aboriginal people very vulnerable. Our life disparity...
growing up, did you feel vulnerable growing up? Did it affect you on a daily basis?
Well, our life expectancy is 20 years below that of a non-Aboriginal Australian. Incarceration rates are much higher. The majority of Aboriginal people live in poverty. So yes, it did affect me growing up. I was someone who lived in a housing commission home. I was someone whose grandparents and parents were, my grandparents were afraid of my parents being stolen and having the children taken away.
Well, let me just
that's something that continues through generations. You get caught in Abo.
Let me just put this to Douglas. You're in favour of, as it were, the First Nation in a country having a sort of special status. So, for example, in the UK, you want to celebrate that here. If the nation is the First Nation, is an Indigenous nation in Australia, surely it should have a special celebration.
Sure, and they do, and that happens.
No, but
I think
a primary one, because they are the first people of that country.
But I think what it's worth seeing is in a wider context. This very similar thing is happening in America, has happened in Canada, and basically this movement, which Australia is part of as well, is there is a movement of people who say everywhere the Europeans went, they've colonized, they've destroyed, they've wrecked, and I think we can have a sensible weighing up of the historical discussion without, if I can say so, saying that the Europeans are colonists, the Europeans are genocidists, the Europeans are still guilty, the Europeans have to keep on.
But they were colonists, that's just a fact.
Yes,
they were colonists.
but the question keeps on coming down to this question as well as historical guilt and the appropriate weighing up of history. And that we hadn't had that in the past in Australia. We don't get it with the burn Australia down stuff either.
Well, thank you both very much.
Where multiple suicide bombings go off in the nearest capital city to this one, where multiple suicide bombings go off at a football match, at a rock venue, drive-by shootings, Kalashnikov attacks in cafes and restaurants, and that wasn't reported, or it just was mentioned, and we all got on with our lives. The public want to know that information. We want to know. I'm going to go to Paris next weekend. Is it a wise idea? Is it good to go or not? Of course we need this information, and we need the media to be reporting it. And I have to say that we have to appreciate what the end point of Simon's point of view on this is. In 2013, when two British converts to Islam, two very radical young men, ran over in broad daylight in South London, in this city, ran over a soldier at home on leave from Afghanistan, Drummer Lee Rigby, hacked at his body in the middle of the road, tried to get his head off with machetes, and so on. Simon described that as a mundane act of violence. Now, I don't think that is a mundane act. It was in your Guardian column at the time.
Oh, sorry.
Anyhow.
It was a mundane act of violence.
But, you see, for most of us, the general public, we don't think that the reporting of a soldier being decapitated in broad daylight by two such men is a mundane thing. It is certainly an act of violence, but we have to be very careful. That is the end point of dismissing the terrorists, of saying we don't give them any oxygen. We try to get around it in some way. Now, I think, by the way, that the censorship around terrorism already exists to an enormous extent in our societies. The media in this country and in America and elsewhere don't show anything like explicit images of the aftermaths of terrorist attacks. And there is a very good argument that actually if the public saw what those of us who've covered and seen attacks have seen, that their views on this would be a lot harder than they currently are, and that the media actually holds this back from the public, and that as a result the public are less enraged than they would otherwise be by this. Said for the BBC. The BBC chose to not use that term. It's so-called Islamic State, as the BBC. Well, that's an editorial decision it takes about the group. I've often said, I keep on hearing the BBC called the so-called Islamic State more times, I'll put my so-called shoes through the so-called television. But it's an infuriating editorial decision, which they've taken before you've even got to reporting the story. That's why you can speak to a lot of people in this country who, despite this, what we're talking about here as being an over-coverage, still have very little idea of what it is that ISIS wants. Because we actually don't have a lot of that discussion, because our broadcasters and our press don't want to have a lot of that discussion. And so we go round and round on the pornography of violence. I'd much rather we had those bigger and deeper discussions that meant that people knew what was actually going on with this group, and what they actually want, and what groups like them want. But just very quickly, I've got to pick up as well on this mention about Sweden, if I may, because this actually does get to a core divide that's going on at the moment. I do not enjoy the bifurcation of American media, I have to say. I don't like the fact that increasingly these are two sides talking about each other, but never to each other. And I think it's enormously regrettable for democracy as a whole. That said, there is a specific problem which the Sweden story actually talks to. Now, as it happens, I've just finished a book
which Fawaz will be, by agreement, promoting any moment. No, which comes out in May. But it's about the migration crisis in Europe. And I've been spending quite a bit of time in Sweden, among other countries. And there are, now it's not terrorism on a daily basis, but there are so many societal problems that have broken out in Sweden in the last few years. And you very, very rarely see anything about it in the press and the media in this country or in America. And I think that what happened in this is emblematic of a problem. So the media doesn't cover the story. Okay, you could say, well, who cares about Sweden, or it's just, you know, it's just this. But the fact is that the non-coverage of that, of a very serious story, and then a sort of cack-handed reference to it by the American president that is responded to by the liberal media saying, ha, 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 it's so hilarious. Sweden's just this wonderful place where everyone's just doing IKEA stuff all the time, is a horrible, horrible deepening of the divide.
May I